If you want to think about it somewhat cynically, you could think, well, the Fed's response to inflation is we're going to cause a recession. That's kind of the only thing that we can do, is to kill demand. One of the concerns is that there's going to be a big impact on the housing sector, and I think we're already seeing that. What would be much better is to see a return of the supply side as well. Anything that can be done to increase supply is going to be both disinflationary and pro-growth. Anything that can be done from a regulatory standpoint to encourage domestic energy production would be a big one.
Good evening. Welcome to NTD's Fresh Look America. I'm Paul Greaney. Nick Reece is the VP of Macro Research and Investment Strategy at Merk Investments. Throughout the COVID pandemic, his analysis and forecasts were among the most accurate that we came upon. So we're delighted to have him today to discuss the economic situation facing the United States. Nick, it's great to see you.
Great to be with you, Paul.
So Nick, I think recession is the big key word over the past few months. How serious do you expect the economic downturn to be?
Well, I think to back up for a second, it's still important to ask how probable a recession is. And I would say it's more likely than not over the next year, or let's say between now and the end of the calendar year of 2023. I'd probably put the probability around, let's say, 2/3 chance, but there is still some chance that we could see what's called the soft landing, meaning that we don't go into recession and we kind of muddle through what would ultimately maybe be looked back on as a mid-cycle slowdown. Again, that's not my base case scenario, but we do want to keep in mind that possibility. Certain things would have to happen to allow that outcome, and we can talk more about that. But in terms of depth, I don't think, and of course it's very hard to say, so there's a lot of uncertainty about the outlook, and it's a very difficult question to answer about the depth. But I would say I wouldn't think about it in terms of being as deep as the Great Recession or the COVID crisis that we had, which were exceptionally deep recessions. One, of course, very short, that was the COVID recession. One very long, which was the Great Recession. So this could be more along the lines of the early 90s recession, something more of what we might call a garden variety recession.
We hear that the Fed may kind of tame its interest rate hikes because potentially of a potential slowdown or recession. What do you think they're watching most closely to judge that?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think the framework that they've laid out, and to back up, part of the reason that they've laid out this very aggressive framework is because they did get it wrong in hindsight last year. They should have been hiking rates last year and removing accommodation from their response to the COVID crisis. And they were late to doing that. Remember, they called inflation transitory as late as August of last year, and it's really kept surprising them on the upside. So now they feel like, okay, there's a risk that the public is going to lose confidence in our ability to fight inflation, and we have to show that we have the resolve to fight it. And instead of making sort of projections about the future and forecasts about what's going to happen to inflation, because they got it wrong in the past and because they've been surprised, they're kind of saying, we're going to keep tightening until we actually see inflation come down. And the risk there, and this is one of the reasons why I think recession is more likely than not, is that they over-tighten because inflation is a lagging indicator. There are a number of processes that are in motion now that result from the rate hikes that they've done that are slowly passing through into inflation. So to give you an example, the housing data, the home price data, let's say the Case-Shiller index, showed the first month-over-month decline in over 10 years. And that's a very good leading indicator as to what's going to happen with rent inflation.
So your base case is a recession. Looking at the strength of the economy and each of its components, where do you see that recession manifesting most prominently?
Well, I think one of the concerns is that there's going to be a big impact on the housing sector, and I think we're already seeing that. So we're seeing house prices come down, but before that we saw housing activity in terms of number of sales, new constructions, things like that falling. So that part of the economy, I think, is already feeling a certain amount of pain. And historically, that sector in the economy is a pretty good long leading indicator for the rest of the economy. So I would think mortgage bankers or real estate agents or home construction would be starting to soften at this point. I think we are seeing that. But what's encouraging is that for the audience that's out there, I would say it's still a very encouraging labor market. There are about 10 million job openings and about 6 million people that are looking for jobs currently. And there are a lot of people we know that left the labor force because of COVID that still haven't come back. So what's good is that the labor market remains strong. It's still a good time to look for a job, to get a job. And I think it's important that that happen. And that would be something that could potentially avoid a recession coming. If you think about this inflation that we've faced, and of course the Fed's response to it, which is really creating problems in the economy, that inflation was caused by fundamentally two forces, one on the supply side and one on the demand side. When COVID hit, that was a negative supply shock. You had people getting thrown out of work, you had all this disruption in terms of global supply chains, and then on the demand side, you had a lot of fiscal stimulus and a lot of monetary stimulus. So the Fed cut rates to zero and engaged in quantitative easing, where they're buying bonds every month, which just loosens financial conditions, it lowers borrowing rates. But I'd say even more powerfully than that was the fiscal stimulus, the many trillions that was going out in the forms of PPP loans or checks in the mail or enhanced unemployment benefits. And that may be warranted, of course, at least to some extent under the circumstances and at the time, but really what that combination does when you increase nominal purchasing power by putting more money in the system and into people's pockets, in the context of a capped supply side, that's a recipe for inflation. And the Fed is sort of tasked with the job of maintaining price stability, is what they officially call it, and they target a 2% annual rate of inflation. But they don't necessarily have the best tools to actually achieve that outcome. The fiscal tools are very, very powerful. So when the Fed is being told by everybody and expected, hey, inflation is your job, you've got to fight this inflation, the only tool they really have is to raise interest rates. And that's affecting the demand side of the equation. And so in some ways, if you want to think about it somewhat cynically, you could think, well, the Fed's response to inflation is we're going to cause a recession. That's kind of the only thing that we can do, is to kill demand. But that's not an ideal outcome. What would be much better is to see a return of the supply side as well. And of course, we want to see maybe both of those things, and the Fed would like to see the supply side improve.
But this is an interesting point, because you correctly say the Fed has very few tools, despite what they say, other than raising interest rates. But could potentially raising interest rates hurt the supply side of the economy as well while they're doing it?
It's a very good question, and the answer that the Fed gives to this question, and I think it's reasonable, and this really comes from the Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari, who was formerly at Treasury. And what he said in answer to that question is that, yes, of course, as you raise interest rates, you're creating problems for producers as well, because the financing costs are going up. It makes it hard to go out and engage in projects and increase the productive capacity of the economy, to build more houses, to build more factories and things like that. The way that they look at it is that is a long-term effect, and that raising rates is going to do more to hinder demand in the short term than it is going to hurt supply, because they're looking at it in the short term. Their framework is we need to get inflation down now. So they're very concerned that if inflation stays high, that could have a knock-on effect into inflation expectations, and that if inflation expectations become what they call de-anchored, then you run into this problem that they're very scared of, which was attributed as one of the dynamics in the 1970s, in that stagflationary period of the 1970s, that there is this self-fulfilling prophecy of if you expect higher inflation, people are going to ask for higher prices, people are going to ask for higher wages, people are going to be paying higher prices, and that there's this feedback loop, this self-perpetuating cycle, that you just don't want to have that psychology of inflation in the psyche of households and firms. And so that's why they're so concerned about bringing inflation down now. And I think the way they're thinking about it is that a recession now that kills inflation is actually better than letting it run hot and then having perhaps a bigger recession down the road.